Yarim Avavyan Oy Shivi Oy Menedi Oy Medive Amoy Oy Mama Shivi Akeres Avagis Tirara
Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Sunday. We can say Shavua Tov, it's a new week, but also Chodesh Tov, because it's a new month. Which new month is it? Adar Sheni, second Adar. So this is the month that is added because it's a Jewish leap year. When we add an entire month, that happens 7 out of every 19 years. Complicated schedule when you're matching a lunar calendar to a solar year. But at any rate, we have a second Adar. Which month is it that gets doubled? The month of joy, the month that includes Purim, right? The Gemara teaches that when Adar enters, our joy increases. So how nice that the month we have to double. You know, it could have been Av, right, which includes Tisha B'Av. That in that month, when that month enters, our joy goes down. But thank God the month we double is the one of increased joy. Today's the first day. It's a 2-day Rosh Chodesh. So we started last night. This morning we had Hallel in synagogue. We'll have it again tomorrow morning, God willing. And in 2 weeks, it'll be Purim. So definitely start thinking about Purim, about fulfilling the mitzvah of hearing the Megillah. We will read the book of Esther in English, so it doesn't fulfill the requirement to hear the Megillah, but we will read the book of Esther as we always do on Purim. We'll do an English reading. Also sending gifts to each other, sending gifts to your friends, gifts to the poor, and the Purim Suda, to have a meal, a celebratory meal on Purim. So that is 2 weeks away. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house on Rosh Chodesh Adar base? Erev Tov, dear Nina, Sal, and everyone from Florence, South Carolina, says Yehudit. Bill in Mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Tom in PA, Bella in Florida, Shandora in the Bronx, Melissa in Great Neck, Paul in the Great Northwest, Mickey in New Jersey, right, Mickey? Saying, I hope you've adjusted to the new time zone. Well, I guess everyone who's with us now has adjusted. Joe in the Inland Empire, Shauna in Canada. Great to have you with us. Dave Garcia, New Jersey here. I am so thankful to have found you. A clear Talmud shir without all the yeshivish speak. This is truly a godsend. I'm so glad you're enjoying it. That is definitely by design, because when I first started learning Talmud, and I went to the so-called English shir, and every other word was in Hebrew or Aramaic. I just couldn't follow it. So we want to keep the learning sophisticated, but accessible to all. And that's why I try, whenever I use a Hebrew term or even Aramaic sometimes, that I will say it in English right away. And if I don't, call me out on it. But great to have you with us, Dave. Karen in Northern California. Sean says shalom. Oh, autocorrect. Guy in Ohio. John in Maine. Belle in Texas. Sharon in New Jersey. Gail Manberg Featherston. That's a new name. Shalom from Sacramento. Welcome, welcome. So good to have you all with us. On the YouTube side, Chaim in Florida, Marjorie in Georgia, Ella saying shalom. Facebook has shut down for updates. Ugh, oh, so sorry to hear that. Okay, let's do it. Our daf today, and that's why I'm willing to take a little extra time at the top, is quite a short daf. So I think I'm going to make it. Now that the clocks have changed, I think I can make it to Mincha Maariv, the afternoon and evening service at the shul down the street, which starts at 6:55 by me. So I think I can make it today. I won't always be able to do that, but it'll just get later and later. Whereas I could make it before class, and for a couple months now it's been during class, so I ended up going to a Maariv, an evening service, later at night. But now I think I can go to Mincha and Maariv right after our class. We got a little head start on page 11. That's our daf today, daf Yud Aleph, page 11 here in Tractate Bava Metzia, the 22nd volume of the Talmud. We're working our way through chapter 1. Tonight, opening Mishnah number 4, which reads, if one saw people running after a found ownerless animal, for example, after a deer that was crippled by a broken leg. Okay, so there's a lot of conditions here, right? So there's an animal. It is an ownerless animal, which means that whoever finds it can claim it. It's running. And it is lame, right? It has a broken leg, meaning it will be caught relatively easily. Or, for example, young pigeons that have not yet learned to fly, which also can be caught easily. And this person said, my field has affected acquisition of this animal for me, so it has affected acquisition of the animal for him. If the deer were running in its usual manner, or the young pigeons were flying, and he said, my field has affected acquisition of this animal for me, then he has said nothing, as one's courtyard cannot affect acquisition of an item that does not remain there on its own. So he's running after this animal, and the last condition is it runs into his field. He can't say that my field affects acquisition when the animal's nowhere near his field. The animal ran onto his field. Maybe several people are running after it, but the animal darted into this guy's field, and he says, my field affected acquisition of that animal. And so it works, right? And what we're talking, again, we've been talking for several days about acquisition and the formal act of acquisition. Usually when you find something, in order to acquire it, you have to pick it up, or if it's an animal, you have to make it move so that people can witness and see, yes, that guy picked it up or took control of the animal and moved it, caused it to move, etc. Sometimes a courtyard can affect acquisition for you. Like if a woman is standing beside her courtyard that she owns and a husband places her bill of divorce in the courtyard, that is going to affect acquisition for her, and they are now divorced, right? And so likewise, a field can affect acquisition for a person because he owns it, but not in all circumstances, as we will see right now. So that was the Mishnah. Now the Gemara. Rav Yehuda says that Shmuel says, and this acquisition mentioned in our Mishnah is effective specifically in a case where the owner is standing next to his field at the time of acquisition, so that it has the halachic status, the legal status of a secured courtyard. So just because you own a piece of land is not enough. For it to acquire possession for you, it has to be a secure courtyard. The sages were set millennia ahead of themselves and already sort of predicting what it would mean when Amazon drops off a package on your porch. And there's definitely a difference between a secure porch and an unsecure porch, as porch pirates have proven. Now, the Gemara raises a difficulty with this. So the idea is that if he's standing next to his field, it's like a secure field because he sees it, because he announces that my field acquired for me. Okay, but how exactly does that work, that him standing next to the field makes it like a secured courtyard, which is able to make acquisition for him? So the Gemara raises a difficulty. But shouldn't his field affect acquisition of the animal for him, even if he was not standing next to it? As Rabbi Yosef, the son of Rabbi Hanina, says, a person's courtyard affects acquisition of property for him, even without his knowledge. What difference does it make if he's standing next to it, if the field can acquire something for him, even if he wasn't aware of it? He was somewhere else and didn't even know it happened. So what difference does it make if he's standing next to it? And the Gemara answers, this statement applies only to a secured courtyard, where items remain in the courtyard without supervision, right? Good porch, secured porch for Amazon packages. But with regard to an unsecured courtyard, if the owner is standing next to his field, yes, it affects acquisition of ownerless items on his behalf. But if he is not, it does not affect acquisition of items on his behalf. And the Gemara asks, and from where do you say that in the case of an unsecured courtyard, if the owner is standing next to his field, yes, it affects acquisition of ownerless items on his behalf. But if he is not standing next to it, it does not affect acquisition of items on his behalf. As it is taught in a Baraisa, there is a case where a landowner was standing in the town and saying, I know that my laborers forgot a sheaf that I have in the field, which I had intended for the laborers to bring in. But since I remember it, it shall not be considered a forgotten sheaf, which must be left to the poor. Right? So what is the forgotten sheaves? What is that law? A sheaf, right? In other words, for us who are farm challenged, what is a sheaf? You're harvesting your wheat, right? And you're with your scythe, you slice down all the stalks of wheat, and then you bundle them together, and then you go back later with your wagon and throw the sheaves into the wagon, right? Bringing in the sheaves. So if you forgot one of the sheaves in the field, very interesting law, then you can't go out to pick it up again because now it belongs to the poor. Your act of forgetting it renders it property of the poor because you forgot it in your field. And how does this work? A sheaf is rendered a forgotten sheaf only if the owner of the field, the laborers, and any onlookers all forgot about it. If the owner says in advance that he knows that the laborers will forget a certain sheaf, then it is not rendered a forgotten sheaf. If the owner is in the town, his declaration has no effect. Further note, a farmer who forgot a sheaf in the field while harvesting his grain may not return to collect it. It must be left for the poor. This is Deuteronomy 24:19, and the details of this mitzvah are elucidated in Tractate Peah. So it's a fascinating command from God that only applies when you've forgotten, right? It's a seemingly sort of random occurrence. Maybe some people will never forget their sheaves. They're very organized, right? They're still going to be giving to the poor. They have to tithe. There's Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, which is for the poor in the 3rd and 6th years of the sabbatical cycle. There's the Peah, the corners of the field, which you are purposely not permitted to harvest, which is left for the poor. There's the gleanings that are dropped, kind of like you don't meticulously comb through your field to make sure you got everything. That you leave for the poor. But sheaves that were bundles that you left there because you forgot, they belong to the poor, and only because you, your laborers, and even the witnesses, the onlookers, all forgot about the sheaf. Okay, so let's keep reading about this. So how is this going to apply? Now, why are we talking about this law in the context of a field acquiring for somebody or not acquiring for someone? Because the farmer is now talking about his field while he's not there. He's in town. But he saw the sheaves in the morning. He said, you know what? They put all the sheaves in a line, right, kind of in an orderly manner, I don't know, every 20 paces in certain rows. But there was one that was kind of irregular. It was near a tree. And I bet they're going to forget that one, right? So that, because of his mindset about it, the fact that his laborers later forgot it, but he thought about it, renders it not a forgotten sheaf. So what happens about that sheaf? Let's see. So there's a case where a landowner was standing in the town and saying, I know that my laborers forgot a sheaf that I have in the field, which I had intended for the laborers to bring in. But since I remember it, it shall not be considered a forgotten sheaf, which must be left for the poor. So then the landowner himself forgot about the sheaf. He remembered it. He said his people are going to forget it. And then later, he forgot about it. So then what? So in this case, one might have thought that it is not considered a forgotten sheaf, since he had originally thought of it and said, my workers are going to forget about it, but I remember. Now, to counter that this, you might think this is not a forgotten sheaf since he initially had that thought, and to counter this, the verse states, when you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. Deuteronomy 24:19. And it is derived from here that the phrase, and have forgotten, applies in the field, but not in town. So the Gemara explains, this baraisa itself is difficult. First you said that one might have thought that it is not considered a forgotten sheaf. So apparently the Tana of this baraisa, right, the rabbi who created this baraisa, so apparently the Tana seeks to prove that it is considered a forgotten sheaf. And then the baraisa adduces the derivation that the phrase, and have forgotten, applies only in the field but not in the town, which apparently means that a sheaf forgotten by the owner while he is in town is not considered a forgotten sheaf. So rather, isn't this what the Tana is saying? In a case where the owner is in the field, if the sheaf was forgotten at the outset, it is considered a forgotten sheaf. But if it was remembered at first and was ultimately forgotten, it does not assume the status of a forgotten sheaf. And what is the reason for this distinction? The reason is that since he is standing in the field beside the sheaf, his field is tantamount to his courtyard. And his courtyard affects acquisition of the sheaf for him once he remembers it. But in a case where the owner is in the town, even if the sheaf was remembered and ultimately forgotten, it is considered a forgotten sheaf and it must be left for the poor. And what is the reason for this? It is because the owner is not standing beside his field, which is necessary for his courtyard to effect acquisition of the sheaf for him. So evidently, an item that is in a person's courtyard is acquired by him only if he is standing next to the courtyard. Now, there were several levels of inferring from one thing to another what the Tana was saying to help bring us back to proving our point that, like in our Mishna, you only acquire when you call that my field acquires for the deer. That only works if you're standing next to the field, but if you're not standing next to the field, it wouldn't work. We're trying to get back to that. So did we just prove that that from the guy remembering while he's standing in town that his workers forgot a sheaf and therefore it's not forgotten because he remembered it, but then later he forgets it, and therefore it's not a forgotten sheaf and it does not go to the poor, or it is going to go to the poor, right? And is this really going to prove the point about standing next to your field? So the Gemara says, no, we haven't proved anything. From where can it be proven that this would be the reasoning? Perhaps the baraisa should be understood in a different manner. It is a Torah edict that if the owner is in the field, it is considered a forgotten sheaf. But if the owner is in the town, it is not considered a forgotten sheaf and does not need to be left for the poor. Accordingly, the distinction would not be derived from the laws of acquisition. It has nothing to do with whether his field acquires for him. It's simply that if he was there when his workers were harvesting and everybody forgot, it's for the poor. But if he wasn't there with his workers, then whether they forgot or not, he can't be considered one who forgot because he wasn't there. Therefore, it doesn't go to the poor. The Gemara responds that the verse, Deuteronomy 24:19, states, you shall not go back to take it. It could have just said, the forgotten sheaves, you shall not take it. But it says, you shall not go back to take it, which is interpreted to include sheaves forgotten while the owner is in the town. Evidently, there is no fundamental difference between a town and the field with regard to the laws of forgotten sheaves. Rather, the distinction is due to the fact that one cannot acquire a sheaf by means of his courtyard if he is not standing next to the courtyard. Gemara challenges this. This phrase is necessary for a different teaching. It's to impose a prohibition upon one who takes his sheaf after he forgot it, instead of leaving it for the poor. It is therefore not superfluous and cannot be interpreted as including an additional case. It's not free for that teaching. And the Gemara answers, well, if that is so, if the verse serves only that purpose, let the verse say, you shall not take it. What is added by the phrase, you shall not go back to take it? It is written to include sheaves forgotten while the owner is in the town. But the Gemara will not agree to this. But the phrase, you shall not go back, is still necessary for what we learned, for that which we learned in a different Mishnah, in Tractate Peah. While a landowner collects the sheaves from his field, any sheaf that remains before him, meaning in front of him, as he has not reached it yet, does not assume the status of a forgotten sheaf, even if he has forgotten about its existence. Any sheaf that is already behind him, that has the status of a forgotten sheaf, as the prohibition of you shall not go back applies. Right? So the Torah is teaching when it says you shall not go back that you can't consider it forgotten until the owner has literally walked past it and not noticed it. This is the principle. Any sheaf to which the prohibition of you shall not go back applies, as one would need to retrace his steps in order to retrieve the sheaf, assumes the status of a forgotten sheaf. And any sheaf to which the prohibition of you shall not go back does not apply, i.e. a sheaf that one has not yet reached, does not assume the status of a forgotten sheaf. So the phrase, you shall not go back, is apparently necessary to teach this law, and it cannot be interpreted as including a case where the owner is in town. So Rav Ashi said that the inclusion of this case is derived from a different phrase in the verse. The verse states, it shall be, which is interpreted to include, right? Let's go back, let's read it again. It shall be. Right? When you reap your harvest in your field and have forgotten a sheaf in the field, you shall not go back to fetch it. It shall be for the stranger, for the fatherless, and for the widow. It could have said, give it to the father, the widows, etc. It shall be for a little bit of a different formulation. So what are we going to learn from that? Where was I? It shall be... I should have put my finger on it. Yes, it shall be. The verse states, it shall be, which is interpreted to include sheaves forgotten while the owner is in the town. Therefore, the Gemara's initial... Wait, does it explain why? Okay, he's not explaining why it shall be relates to the guy is absent, but that's how Rav Ashi is reading it. Which is interpreted to include sheaves forgotten while the owner is in the town. So therefore, the Gemara's initial interpretation of the Baraisa is accepted, leading to the conclusion that the distinction between a case where the owner is in the field and a case where he is in the town is due to the law that one's courtyard can effect acquisition of property for him only if he is standing next to it, as Rav Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel. And Ula also says that the acquisition mentioned in the Mishnah is effective specifically in a case where the owner is standing next to his field. And Rabba Bar Chana also says that the acquisition is effective specifically in a case where he is standing next to his field. And that would seem to square with our Mishnah, where the guy says, my field has acquired that lame deer that's running away from all of us, and it darted into my field acquired it. So it's like he saw it, he must be standing next to his field. So Rabbi Abba raised an objection to Ula from that which is taught in a Mishnah, Tractate Meiser Sheni. There was an incident involving Rabban Gamliel and other elders. Right, so Rabban Gamliel was the Nasi, right? He was the head of the Sanhedrin, and so there were other senior rabbis traveling with him, sages, and they were traveling on a ship. Rabban Gamliel remembered that he had not tithed the produce of his fields. So Rabban Gamliel said to the others, 1/10 of my produce, which I will measure out in the future and separate from my produce, is given to Yehoshua ben Hananiah, who is a Levi, right? And it's the Levium who receive the tithe. The Kohanim, the priests, receive the first 2%, that's called Teruma. Then 10% of what is left is given, that's called Meiser Rishon, the first tithe, and that's given to the Levites, who did not receive land when Joshua led the children of Israel into Israel and apportioned all the land. The tribe of Levi didn't get land. Instead, their portion was Hashem, their portion was God. And one of the things that they received because they would serve God all their days is the first tithe, right? So, and you can pick which Levite you give to. So Rabban Gamliel says, I'm going to give it to Yehoshua ben Hananiah, right? He wants to tithe the produce that he left piled along his fields and that he left town in a hurry. So he says, okay, it's there. When I get back, I'll separate the 10% and I'm going to give it to Yehoshua ben Hananiah. That's an intent to do it in the future, but he wants it to happen now. So how can he give the tithe to the Levite while all of them are on a ship at sea? So now we're on 11b. All right, so he says, I'm going to give it. It is hereby given to Yehoshua ben Hananiah, who is a Levite, and is entitled to receive the first tithe. And the place of the tithe is rented to him. Right? So he's saying that he's going to separate that 10% of his produce. He's going to put it in a specific spot on his property. And the spot, that little piece of land on which the 10%, the tithe, is resting for Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah, he's actually renting that piece of land to Rabbi Yehoshua ben Hananiah. And that transaction of renting the land to him, they finalized immediately on the ship. Rabbi Yehoshua paid him a token sum to rent that portion of the land, which presumably became the equivalent of his courtyard, and thereby acquired the tithe for him. And another 1/10, says Rabban Gamliel, another 1/10 that I will measure out in the future, this is the Meiser Sheni, the second tithe, and separate from my produce as the poor man's tithe, the Meiser Sheni. This is given to Akiva ben Yosef, that's the famous Rabbi Akiva, so that he will acquire it for the poor, right? He's going to collect second tithe on behalf of the poor and distribute it to them. And its place is rented to him, right? So the next 10% gets a different piece of land, and that piece of land is rented to Akiva ben Yosef. And now that Akiva owns that little piece of land, he has rights to it because he just rented it, his courtyard presumably has acquired the second tithe on behalf of the poor. Ula said, now Rabbi Abba brought this up to say that you don't have to be standing next to your field in order for your field to acquire something for you. You don't have to be standing next to your courtyard in order for your courtyard to acquire something for you. And this was his proof. And he used that to challenge Ula, who said, you do have to be standing next to your field. So now Ula said to him, this one of the sages, meaning Rabbi Abba, this one of the sages seems like one who has not studied halacha, who has not studied Jewish law. Meaning, Ula dismissed Rabbi Abba's challenge entirely as he deemed it unworthy of consideration. He's saying, your point is so stupid, I'm not even going to answer it. I don't need to reject it. I don't need to show you why you're wrong. It's like you're an ignoramus. Now, Ula was an edgy guy, and we have many examples of Ula speaking in a rather edgy manner to people. He was kind of impatient, irascible, which is not a worthy quality for the sages, but it was his quality. And Ula is a very important sage because he was the one who traveled between the community of sages in the land of Israel, which was under Roman occupation, back and forth to the community of sages in Bava, which was part of the Persian Empire and had much more liberty to teach and learn Torah than the sages under the brutal Roman occupation. And since Ula went back and forth a lot, he was very important so that the two communities could keep track with each other, right? It wasn't enough to send letters. You wanted a sage who was going back and forth, could tell you what they were discussing, what they were up to, what was going on in the two communities. Okay, so now Rabbi Ula has been very dismissive about Rabbi Abba. Now, when Rabbi Abba, who was probably a little bit miffed, but kept his mouth shut, when Rabbi Abba came to Sura, so that's a city in Babel, with a big Jewish academy, a big yeshiva. When Rabbi Abba came to Sura, he related the discussion to the local scholars, saying to them, this is what Ula said, and this is how I challenged him. And one of the sages said to him, Rabban Gamliel transferred ownership of the movable property, meaning the tithes, to them by means of renting them the land. The transaction concerning the tithes was effected not by causing the location of the produce to become the equivalent of a courtyard belonging to Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Akiva, and then their courtyard then acquired the tithe for them, but rather by employing the principle that movable property can be acquired together with the acquisition of the land. When they acquired the land, they acquired the movable property that was resting on it. That was the deal they were making, right? He was saying, okay, rent this property, and when you rent it, along with it, you'll acquire ownership of what's on it, right? And that would be the tithe that was sitting on it. So it's not that their courtyard that they had rented then acquired for them. It was that the movable property was transferred along with the land underneath it. And that is a valid king, and that is a valid mode of acquisition. So it had nothing to do with somebody's courtyard acquiring for him when he's not there. Rather, it was that there was a land transfer, in this case a rental, but it's still a land transfer, and that the movable property went along with it, and the right to use it, the right to take the tithe off it. Now the Gemara comments, Rabbi Zera accepted this response to Rabbi Abba's objection, meaning he understood what Ula was saying and he agreed with it. But Rabbi Abba did not accept it. Rabbi Abba was not convinced. If that's what Ula meant, no, Ula's wrong, and he was definitely wrong to dismiss me because he got it wrong. Rava said, Rabbi Abba did well by not accepting this response, right? So Rava is siding with Rabbi Abba against the opinion of Ula and against the agreement of Rabbi Zera. So Rav is saying, why was Rabbi Abba correct? He did well by not accepting this response because if Rabban Gamliel had intended to transfer his ownership of the tithes to Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Akiva, did they not have a cloth with which to acquire the tithes from him by means of symbolic exchange? They could have acquired the tithes through symbolic exchange without renting the land. Rather, clearly the tithes were not considered the property of Rabban Gamliel, as he owned only the benefit of discretion, meaning he had the right to choose which Levite the tithe would go to, or which charity collector the second tithe would go to. And that's a benefit, that you can pick which priest gets teruma, or which Levite gets Meiser Rishon, or which charity collector, gets the poor man's tithe. The fact that you can choose, that has value. That is an advantage. That's called the benefit accrued from the option of giving the tithes to whichever Levite or poor person that he chose. And such benefit is not considered property that it's a benefit, but it's not considered property that can be acquired by means of a symbolic exchange. And here too, the transaction was clearly effected by means of a courtyard, as benefit of discretion is not considered property that can be acquired by means of acquiring land. Therefore, Rabbi Abba's explanation must be correct, and one's courtyard affects acquisition for him even when he is not standing next to it, contrary to the opinion of Ula. But the Gemara rejects Rava's reasoning and therefore rejects Rabbi Abba's argument. Says the Gemara, but that is not so. With regard to gifts to which members of the priesthood are entitled, and similarly with regard to tithes that are given to the Levites and to the poor, the concept of giving is written explicitly in the Torah, Deuteronomy 26:12, and have given it to the Levite, to the stranger, to the fatherless, and to the widow. These gifts must be given and not sold or bartered. Therefore, since exchange is a form of buying and selling, it is an inappropriate mode of acquisition with regard to tithes. By contrast, transferring ownership of movable property by means of transferring ownership of land, this is a powerful form of giving. Consequently, Rabban Gamliel could not give them the tithes by means of a symbolic exchange using a cloth, but instead had to give it to them along with the land. And therefore, since the transaction was not effected by means of a courtyard, it poses no difficulty to Ula's opinion. Rav Papa said, Even if Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Akiva acquired the tithes by means of a courtyard, this poses no difficulty to Ula's opinion, since the tithes were not ownerless items, but rather another mind, i.e. Rabban Gamliel, transferred their ownership to Rabbi Yehoshua and Rabbi Akiva. So it is different, and the recipients need not stand next to the courtyard. What he's saying is, you have to be standing next to your courtyard for your courtyard to acquire an ownerless item, like this slow-running deer or young, basically flightless pigeon that darts into your field. They were ownerless before, and you can say my field acquires them only if you're standing next to the field because they're ownerless. But when we're talking about somebody giving something to someone else, there's a transfer from one human to another human. That's different, right? And we saw that distinction before, where in order for a person to sell let's say a donkey to another person, once the money changes hands, right, the buyer still has not acquired the donkey, he has to then make a king, and he has to an active acquisition by, for example, making the donkey move by driving it forward, or pulling the reins and making the donkey move that way, or the seller can take the reins in his hand and transfer the reins to the buyer's hand. Even if the donkey doesn't move, this transfer of the reins from the seller to the buyer works. But if it was an ownerless donkey that for whatever reason, its previous owner died and left no heirs, so now whoever gets it first is going to become its owner. If somebody simply picked up the reins, he did not acquire the donkey until he makes the donkey move. So just picking up the reins doesn't work, even though with a seller and a buyer, transferring the reins into his hand would work. And so here he's saying that since Rabban Gamliel was a person transferring to another person the tithes, the first tithe to Rabbi Yehoshua and the second tithe to Rabbi Akiva, it would work, even though for ownerless objects, it wouldn't. And from where do you state this distinction, Rav Papa? Says Rav Papa, as we learned in the Mishna, if one saw people running after a found ownerless animal and said, my field has effected acquisition of this animal for me, it has effected acquisition of it for him. And Rabbi Yirmiyah says that Rabbi Yochanan says that this law is true only in a case where he would be able to run after them and catch them. That's why it mattered that the deer had a broken leg or the pigeons were flightless because they were so young, because he could catch them. And Rabbi Yirmiyah raises a dilemma. Does one acquire animals that are given to him as a gift in such a scenario? Rabbi Abba Bar Kahana accepted the premise of the dilemma of Rabbi Yirmiyah and ruled that in the case of a gift, one acquires the animals even if he would not be able to run after them and catch them. And what is the reason for this distinction? Is it not because when another mind transfers their ownership, the law is different in that the courtyard affects acquisition of the items with fewer limitations? Like, for example, you don't have to be standing next to it. This supports Rav Papa's explanation. I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in. Rav Shimi said to Rav Papa, but what about the case of a bill of divorce, a get, where another mind, the husband, transfers its ownership to the wife, and nevertheless, Ula himself says, with regard to one who threw a get into his wife's house or courtyard, but it is a valid divorce only if she is standing next to her house or next to her courtyard. And Rav Papa responded, a get, a bill of divorce, is different, as it is possible to give it to one's wife even against her will. She doesn't have to agree to receive the get. That's why her courtyard can acquire it for her, because she won't accept it in her hand. Rav Sheshes, the son of Rav Edi, objects to this response. But is it not a kal v'chomer inference? If, in the case of a bill of divorce, which is valid even if it is given to the wife against her will, nevertheless, if she is standing next to her house or next to her courtyard, she does acquire the bill of divorce. And if she's not standing next to it, she does not acquire it. Then, here's the kal v'chomer. In the case of a gift, which one can receive only willingly, is it not all the more so correct that the recipient must be standing next to his courtyard for the transaction to take effect? So rather, Rav Ashi said that the distinction between the cases of a gift and a get should be explained as follows. One's courtyard is included as a valid means of acquisition due to the fact that it acts as his hand, but it is no less effective than agency. Therefore, with regard to a bill of divorce, a get, which is considered detrimental to his wife, one cannot transfer it to her by placing it in her courtyard in her absence, as one cannot act against the interests of a person unless it is in his presence. Plus, we want her to know that she's divorced. That's another reason. By contrast, with regard to a gift, which is beneficial for the recipient, one can give it to him by placing it in his courtyard, even in the recipient's absence, as one can act in a person's interest in his absence. If there's no detrimental aspect to because really you're being his agent, right? You're doing something on his behalf without him even knowing about it. You can do that if there is absolutely no detrimental aspect to that action. So have we resolved the question of, is it because he's standing next to his field that his field acquires this ownerless animal which runs into his field and is going to stay there because it's a lame deer or a flightless pigeon? But is it only working because he's standing there or not? Sounds like yeah, because he's standing there, but we're not sure yet. Looks like only one question from Joseph. How does payas actually work? Do the poor just wander into the owner's field and acquire the food by picking it up? Well, the paya, right, so the corner of the field has to be left unharvested. So the poor are going to have to do a little bit of work, right, which is actually good. It's what you want. The poor are sort of maintaining their dignity by they go there. They don't own the land. They wouldn't normally be entitled to just walk on somebody's land and harvest wheat from it. But what's in the corners is left just for that reason. So they acquire it. I mean, think about it. They're going to, how do you do this? Like, you're taking your scythe and you're chopping it down and then you pick it up. And that's how they acquire it for themselves as opposed to other poor people. Only poor people can acquire it. And who's going to acquire it? The first one who comes in and cuts it down and takes it. That's what I've got for us today, and with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Monday, at the regular time, 6 p.m. Pacific.